Welcome, everyone. My name is Jason Bourne. I'm Vice President for Programs at the National Center for Family Philanthropy. Thank you for joining us today for our monthly Fundamentals of Family Philanthropy webinar. This series provides guidance on the core tenets of effective family philanthropy, from motivations and values to governance, grant-making, and succession. The series is designed to equip giving families with the latest information on evergreen topics in the donor life cycle through practical takeaways and diverse family stories that illustrate important practices. Today's topic is about balancing the individual and collective interests within a shared giving effort. For many, family philanthropy presents an opportunity to create a shared experience, unifying the family by working together toward a lasting legacy of impact. Family philanthropy can also give participants an opportunity to explore and cultivate their personal philanthropic passions. Yet there is an inherent tension between these two goals, and many families struggle with how to address it, especially as families become larger and more complex over time. In today's webinar, we'll explore three critical questions. First, what are the strategies to balance individual interests and perspectives alongside a collective giving effort? Second, how can you assess when to collaborate and when to pursue individual paths? And finally, what are the most important considerations for families as they engage in collective and multi-generational family philanthropy? Before we begin, let me briefly share about our webinar technology. We want this webinar to be interactive, so please submit questions for the panelists at any time. To ask a question, please use the question box as indicated on the current slide. When sending in a question, if you wish to remain anonymous, please just indicate that in the question. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and a replay will be made available to all attendees. If you experience any technical issues, please reconnect to the technology or email jen.crino@ncfp.org. As always, you're welcome to and encouraged to chat with us on Twitter about today's webinar using the hashtag #NCFPWeb. Let me now briefly introduce our wonderful panel, and then we can move into today's discussion. Today, we're joined by Ashley Blanchard, partner and head of philanthropic practice at Landsberg Gersick & Associates, and also a trustee of the Hill Snowden Foundation and NCFP's vice chair of our board. Also joining us is Andy Klingenstein, chairman and CEO of Klingenstein Philanthropies, Melinda Oakes, executive director of the Triad Foundation, and Wendy Lasik, partner and head of leadership development coaching practice for Landsberg Gersick & Associates. Wendy and Ashley will begin with a brief opening presentation, and then we'll open it up for a full panel discussion. We're so thrilled to have you all joining us for this important topic, and let me turn it over to you, Wendy and Ashley. Thank you so much.
Hi, Jason. It's great to be here. I'm sharing my screen. Give me a moment for technology. Okay, great. It's wonderful to be here. We are so excited to have this conversation with Melinda and Andy. This topic is near and dear to my heart and to Wendy's heart. We spend a lot of time working with clients on this issue, and we're currently doing research with NCFP, which we'll talk more about in a moment, in the midst of data collection and analysis right now. So it's very much front and center for us. And as Jason said, it's a fundamental issue for families who work together in their philanthropy. So just to start kind of in giving you all some context here, this issue is fundamental in all family dynamics, not exclusive to philanthropy at all. This, for my psychologist colleagues like Wendy and folks who are really immersed in family system theory, this tension between individuation and collaboration is really at the center of family systems work. So on one hand, you have this push outward towards individuation, towards being one's authentic self. On the other hand, you have this pull inward towards your family, towards being part of a family. And that tension is very much alive and well in family philanthropy, where you often have, on one hand, a goal of nurturing individuals' own philanthropic interests, empowering them to be great philanthropists, training them to, give back in their own communities. On the other hand, you have this desire for people to come together to be the kind of the family glue that will unite the family. And those impulses are in tension, and that tension is sort of alive and well in many family foundations. And what we want to talk about today is how families manage that tension in various ways. So what we are going to share briefly on for the next few minutes is some research, building on some research that our colleague Kellen Gersick did in his book, Generations of Giving, published back in 2004 in partnership with the center. Wendy and I are now building on that research, whereas Kellen's book really looked at continuity in multi-generational family foundations and ways that they evolve and change over time. What we're looking at now is building on that research to say, what can we learn about success and continuity in family foundations when we pull back the lens to look at the broader family philanthropic system? So we're looking at 20 more philanthropic families that are by definition complex, that have multiple giving vehicles, that allow, that have a kind of legacy foundation, but also have other shared and individual giving vehicles to better understand how the interplay of those vehicles contributes to or detracts from the success of the family's ability to collaborate in a legacy foundation. And what we're finding, and no great surprise, but if you look at the evolution of these various complex family philanthropy systems, the choices that they make over time to, carve out new foundations, to pull together and collaborate, to start new initiatives, are all really about fundamentally how they want to reconcile individual and collective impulses that emerge at different times in their evolution. So all of this is really grounded also in this notion of family development. And when you think about family philanthropy, there's this fairly common trajectory, not the only story, certainly, but in many families, we find a similar path, right? Which is that you start with the founders, mom and dad, or grandparents who give, primarily as an extension of their individual giving through a family foundation or through a foundation. It may not even be a family foundation in its origin. And then they may give access over time to their children, but it remains a fundamentally individualistic endeavor, right? People are giving to their own interests. They may at some point choose to come together and do some things collectively, right? Some shared interests. People may kind of bring some of their own personal interests to the shared board table and say, this is of interest to me. Does anyone else want to support it? Can we make a grant from the foundation? So that's sort of a normal progression that you see. Some families choose to continue that individualistic approach, and that can look different in different families, but it often looks like either straight up discretionary funding, kind of dividing the pie. It can look like a sort of quid pro quo system, so it's not clearly defined, but there's a collective pot and people kind of come to the table with their own interests, and there's an implicit idea that if we'll fund mine about equal as other people's. In other cases, you see families where people have their own sort of programmatic domains. So you have the arts program, which is really the purview of one person. The environment program is the purview of someone else, and that can go on for a number of generations. But ultimately, that system of individuation becomes harder and harder to maintain as families get bigger. It becomes really a challenge of the numbers. More people, more diversity, more perspectives, hard to continue to divide the pie, if you will. So at some point, families face a choice. And that choice is, do we continue to individuate? And in the long run, that typically ends in kind of some sort of division, or do we choose to collaborate? And what that looks like, I'll talk about in a moment, but this is a choice that families make. And what we found in our research is that there were typically these sort of inflection points where families had to proactively make this choice. And just as a way to illustrate this, I, as Jason mentioned, am a trustee of the Bill Snowden Foundation, fourth generation trustee. Our narrative is illustrative of this. So my great grandfather started the foundation. He had a daughter. She really maintained the kind of controlling trustee role as she inherited the foundation essentially in its leadership, granted access to my father and his siblings, and they all did their own sort of personal philanthropy through the foundation for a number of years. In the mid 1990s, there were a confluence of events that forced everyone to step back and think, what do we want to do with this? So my generation came of age. There was an increase in assets. My grandmother passed away. And there was a choice made to operate the foundation differently, that it would no longer be an extension of people's individual giving, but we would choose to do something collaboratively. We would pick a focus. We would hone in on a strategic choice. We would professionalize. We actually ended up choosing a strategic priority that was not central to any individual, chose a geographic location where none of us lived. So we chose to really hone in on a particular area where we felt we could have an impact. Different families make different choices, but again, our research is finding is that there is really a choice that families make and have to proactively make that choice together. It's just a recap of the dynamic that I just shared here. I also just want to say quickly what we're talking about here when we talk about these choices, a sort of either or dynamic. Many people will say, well, can't you do both? And surely many families have some outlet for individual giving and collaborative giving. But what we're talking about here is what's primary. And what we've also found in the research is that it's really critical to differentiate between the two and to name which is primary. And typically that's just by, allocation of assets. But it's we found that it can be very confusing in families where those lines are blurred. So when I'm talking about collaboration, I'm not just talking about, a voting system where we all, it's a democratic system where we all vote. True collaboration has a few components in our experience. One is that there is this choice, which I mentioned, that people choose to subvert their individual interests for the sake of a collective process. So they go into it knowing, I may not get my thing here. We may not do what I, Ashley, find most important, but that's okay because it's more important to me that we do something together. So people have to proactively make that choice. The second part is that there has to be some collective process to identify shared priorities and to manage the grant making. So that has a few components. One is planning, right? That there's some process that people go through together to figure out what they're going to focus on. There's a strategy that emerges, by which I really mean a shared decision-making framework, that everyone comes to a place where they agree on what they will and will not fund. They know going in what they will say yes or no to, how they will make decisions, and often, but not always, accompanied by increased professionalism. Wendy, did you want to add anything before I turn it over to you?
No, I'm all set, Ashley, thanks. As Ashley said, we're really in the process of completing interviews and analyzing the data for the current study of 20 multi-generational US-based philanthropic families. And it's anonymous participation of these families. And so we just want to give a shout out and thank them for their time and input. We'll be presenting these results in a fuller form at the annual NCFP forum in the fall of 2022. In the meantime, we do have preliminary and key research findings to date to share with you today, including the fact that those who consider their family philanthropy successful, and by successful, families have told us that they have great family satisfaction and they've achieved great impact, they tend to do the following. They recognize that too much individual giving erodes the collaborative. So we are confirming right now that there is a range of individual giving up to approximately 20% that works well. Over this percentage, it tends to tip the balance, making family collaborative philanthropy less likely to be sustained over time. These families recognize the need for and often provide outlets for individual philanthropic expression. And this can occur both inside the foundation, such as compensating trustees for their time with individual discretionary funds, or outside the family foundation through the creation of branch foundations or the use of individual DAFs, what have you. This tends to be quite a successful model that we've seen both in the research and in our consulting work, where people are encouraged to pursue their own individual passions outside of the foundation. This can get difficult as the number of family members grows over the generations, and there might be an increase in disparity of wealth over time. So this kind of solution can become more complicated. Their philanthropy has a clarity of purpose and distinguishes between the collaborative and the individual philanthropy. So as Ashley said, we find many systems that do both, but we find that the family systems that manage the tensions well over generations really have that clear primary goal. And this helps to serve as a guiding light and mitigate confusion. Finally, they offer opportunities for varying levels of engagement and a chance to opt out should family members not have time or the ability to commit at a certain time in their lifespan. And they recognize that this, as Ashley said, this individual collaborative tension is really inherent to their system, and they cannot be resolved by a silver bullet, but it needs to be managed over time and revisited periodically to make sure that that balance is right. So moving on to the next slide, we're often asked about, well, what do the findings, what does your research and your consulting work tell us about the do's and don'ts for sustaining family philanthropy over time? So here are 5 suggestions related to our findings to date. The first is don't let, quote, collaboration fatigue, end quote, lead to shifting the balance too far from collective to individualized philanthropy. So while it takes time and communication to collaborate, to negotiate with one another, the outcomes are worth the effort. 2, don't let the rising generation's anxiety about the demands of governance trap them into smaller venues. So we coach rising generation leaders, and we often hear from them that they are unsure about the value that they themselves bring to the board table or to the grant committees, or that they're not sure they're going to have the time to commit to do the work. Regardless, we find that the families who invite the next gen to the main table are often rewarded with new, rich, multi-generational decision-making and perspectives. 3, don't underestimate the value of collaborative philanthropy as a way to sustain family continuity. It is in fact a glue, and it can work really well. 4, do separate the work of the family from the work of the foundation. And what do we mean by this? Keep historical family branch tensions or individual tensions out of the boardroom, out of your philanthropic boardroom. This is true also for family who have operating businesses. We find that it's best when those business and ownership issues are not allowed to bleed into the trustees of the philanthropic work of your system. Create other governance forums, for example, a family owners council, for those kinds of important and necessary discussions. And finally, 5, do engage in holistic planning about values, vision, purpose, and allocation of the family human capital. This is really critical to take a time to take that retreat for that perspective taking. So now, with great delight, Ashley and I are going to turn it over to Andy and Melinda, who will share with us their own experience and find out what, if any, of these research findings actually make sense to their own experience. So thank you, Melinda and Andy, for joining us. I just ask you to unmute. And in light of what we just shared, can you please start by telling us a bit about some of the key moments in your own family foundation's history and evolution? And in that telling, if you could perhaps highlight, when were choices made to collaborate? When were choices made to allow for greater individual autonomy? And how did those choices inform the path of your philanthropic systems? Melinda, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. I think a couple of the things that I marked down as key milestones were, of course, the foundation. And I think it's important to note that the original funder of establishing the foundation did not lay out his wishes or his ambitions. So there's been, some amount of assuming what would have been important to him. And that led to some problems in the original decade of the foundation's existence, and ultimately a split. At the origins, the family was, the board was part family, part outside members. When they split is when the foundation that I work at, Triad Foundation, formed, and it came off of the original foundation. And at that point in time, one of the things that they didn't want to experience again was actually that collective collaboration, because they understood that everybody's got really big, exciting, and diverse ideas, and they didn't want that to hinder them because of the experience they had at the onset. So it doesn't mean I disagree with any of the content that you provided, but what it means is it was really important to this foundation to have more discretionary ability. There are a few parameters, a couple big grants come off the top year on year that we are historically committed to, as well as a 20% spend related to what they think the original funder would have determined was important to him. Otherwise, the budget split 3 ways. Another key milestone is when the family chose to move from in-house endowment management to an outsourced model. I think that took away some committee work that not everybody had expertise in or interest in or necessarily transparency into. And taking away that little piece of what some perceived as power and some perceived as their lack of power was very important, and I think instrumental in creating a more amicable experience for everyone. And then finally, I'll say the decision to specifically budget that 20% to what they think are legacy organizations. In that 20% spend, they can also choose to join with each other on grants that are maybe not legacy grants, but really encouraging that spirit of togetherness. And those are the main milestones within this foundation.
Thanks so much, Melinda. Andy, can you share with us your experience?
So thank you, Wendy, and thanks for having me. So I am the chair of 3 family foundations we call now Klingenstein Philanthropy. And the short history may speak to some of your questions, although there weren't too many times when there was considered thought about this. So the largest of our 3 foundations was established by my grandfather, Joe, who made all the dough or most of the dough. And he had no particular philanthropic vision. He was very committed to family, and he had a charitable bent, but no vision, and that was somewhat liberating. So the second generation, he and my grandmother had 2 children, one of whom was my dad, the second generation. And so my dad was sort of the chief philanthropic officer for the family for many, many years. And he made sort of feints along the way toward involving other family members. We had discussions about the difference between being informed and being involved and various forays along the way. But we, out of respect for him largely in the job that he was doing, with one exception that I maybe mention later, we let him go on his way, and gratefully. But in the early 90s, we, members of my generation, there were 8 of us, established our own foundation through a capital grant from the larger foundation. It had its own interest. It found its own interest in mental health. And then there's a third foundation that is related to another side of the family. And then sometime, maybe 20 years later, the larger foundation split in two to accommodate a very large gift that one of the sides of the family wanted to make. By the way, I didn't think that was a very good thing to do for reasons I can discuss. And one important thing I think in our family is we've accommodated or made peace with this, what you call this tension, Wendy. I wouldn't have quite put it that way. But in part because we recognize the value and the power of family philanthropy, but also because we have our own resources with which to do and follow our own philanthropic passions. So there has never been great tension along the lines that you described.
great. So Ashley and I are curious, which of the themes that we shared from the research most resonated with you, Andy? If you could talk first about that, and were there any that did not resonate with you, and why?
No, it all resonated with me, particularly this idea that, if you pursue, actually, I'd say in the last 30 years, we've narrowed the focus and made ourselves more collective. We used to have small programs where we'd allow discretion, no longer. We used to have actually bigger programs that represented more of the interests of one side of the family or another, no longer. Now our family philanthropy works as a family. And I think people take pride in that and enjoy working together as a family, see that it does help strengthen the family. But also I think there's a sense that we are more effective sometimes. It's more powerful philanthropy to do it collectively. It of course forces choices and things, but it's certainly not everybody is passionate about all areas that we undertake.
Right, that's great, Andy. Thank you. And Melinda, I mean, it's interesting because we've encountered some systems, Melinda, that it's a deductive approach. So you start with these values and vision and collaborative purpose, and you go down, or you start with it more an inductive approach where people are doing their paths and then they start seeing some merging interests. Do you find that happening at all? It's more of an inductive process, or would you foresee that happening in the future?
It's hard to say. I think in the world of family philanthropy, we're still relatively young. We have the original founding members of the organization still integral on the board and being the main decision makers. So I wouldn't dare answer about how it will evolve well. I think, like you said, we all sort of face the exact same issues, and being that it's all in the family, not everyone is super transparent about it. I also think being a staff member and viewing it gives me sort of an emotional opportunity to say I would do it differently or I would do it the same. That may not actually be what happens when you are living it as Andy is. I certainly agree with everything Andy said. And I would say one of the things that resonated most with me was really the topic of choice. And I think when you're trying to keep a family together and put the family first, I would work really hard to make sure everybody knows that, their participation is a choice. There's this saying that you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your family, but you can also pick your work and the way you engage in your community. And I think that's very crucial. Another thing that I would just add that I think has been important in the family is setting it up so that, having gone through a split once already, they're sensitive to the toll that takes on a family, and they have worked it into the bylaws that if that should happen, that it's possible to happen very straightforward way without too much emotion, or to actually operate as one foundation with more or less two separate family budgets. So that is sort of our future. It's not where we are right now, but the bylaws are crafted so that sort of evolution could take place amicably.
That's a great share. Thank you, Melinda. Ashley, do you have?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that because, and we have some questions I think related to this in the chat and Q&A, which is, in many families, there is a preference for individuation. And actually one of the findings from the research pilot that Wendy did with some colleagues of ours was that there was this almost inverse correlation between families who do work with a high degree of collaboration in some sort of legacy foundation and their degree and desire for privacy and autonomy outside of the foundation. So for family members, when we heard time and again, I put all this energy and effort and time into collaboration because it really is energy and effort and time. It is work to collaborate. I don't want to spend that time and energy with my family outside of that experience talking about our philanthropy. I need that release valve to do my own thing. And so that was very much a common theme. But in many families, as I said, I mean, it is very common in many families that choose a path of coexistence, that the ultimate outcome of that path at some point is some sort of division or split, because it's sort of not worth it to put the energy into doing that under a common umbrella at some point in time. As common as it is, as developmentally appropriate as it may be, and Wendy and I have certainly advised clients at times that that is the best path for a family at a particular juncture to choose not to work together. It's still often painful. And I'm curious, in your experiences, I mean, Melinda, you just touched on this, what guidance you might give to other families, given that there have been these, divisions in both of your histories, for how to, who might be having that potentially on the agenda or on their radar, for how one could do that in a way that could be as, painless as possible, to the extent possible. Linda, you just talked about some things that have been baked into the structure to prevent unnecessary friction in the event that the family chooses to go that way.
I would only add that I try to put fun first. As a staff member and an executive director, I look at my job as singularly to help the family enjoy what they're doing, period. And then, of course, protecting them from the law and the choices that they're making, and ensuring that everything is, perfectly within the guidelines of family foundations. Of course, that's a part of my role, but first and foremost is ensuring that it's an enjoyable experience. And I think that helps tremendously. I mean, sometimes it means I'm the funnel in conversations. Sometimes it's just a matter of having themed board meetings. It's another thing is engaging the next generation in a way that makes them feel like they're already a part of it, so that there's not this moment where they're stuck with the shock of engagement. But again, the family's been instrumental in setting up those mechanisms, and I just get to steward them through it.
Annie, what about you? Any thoughts about how you might advise families who are thinking that it may not make sense for them to work together anymore, having kind of been through an experience similar in your history?
I'm not sure I would be so presumptuous, Ashley. It's all, if the question is, how do you know? I mean, because as I said, we've had different workarounds under different circumstances. I guess I like, Melinda's idea about being flexible in the charter documents or the legal documents to allow that. As I said, I'm a bit of a contrarian in that I think that particularly multi-generational foundations that have been around for a long time with established interests should think long and hard before they break up along family lines in deference to what's been built, which is a quasi-public good. So I know it's legal, but
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a related question, Andy. I'll start with you on this one. One of the things that we find to be true, certainly in our consulting and the research, is that families come to these decisions about how they're going to work together, what kind of overarching model they're going to use, but those decisions are often renegotiated over time, right? More people, different viewpoints come into the mix, and so they have to think about, every sort of generation, typically, how do we want to do this? How do we accommodate or not different interests? Do we, wrestling with that tension, I think, families, even when they have a well-established sort of focus, often have to contend with to what degree do we, shift course to accommodate the different players. I'm curious if you have any thoughts or guidance on that from, having.
I actually do. So I have 4 daughters who are among the most active of the next generation in our family. They have widely different views among themselves. And I think if left to their own device, they would, if they were in control, they would choose a different path. But that said, they're very respectful of what has been built, and they understand the family sort of history, culture is to move the ship very slowly. We get into interest areas very slowly, and we get out of them even more slowly. So somewhere in there is a solution, and we haven't figured it out. So I'd be pretty presumptuous to offer much more of advice.
Great, Melinda. I mean, thinking about your next generation and the ways that you're getting them engaged, I'm curious what you are doing and if what that engagement looks like for your next generation. Because as you said, you're still young, but the questions that we're bringing up around what the future will look like, obviously, what you're doing now to engage them may determine what that path looks like to some extent for them. So I'm curious what you're doing, and is it focused more on fostering their own individual philanthropy and keeping with the ethos of the foundation to date, or are you doing things to bring them together to collaborate and learn to work together as well?
It's both. I think when they split and this family started Triad Foundation, it was agreed that all the board members, with the exception of the spouses of the three founders, being a father and two children, all the other board members in the bylaws must be lineal descendants. So starting with that, the first time first of all, the family members have always been welcome at all the meetings. But the first time they truly engage and have decision-making abilities is at the age of 10. And from 10 to 18, they have a very small discretionary budget for each of the members. And that goes from 10 to 18. And then on top of that, they also have a collective pot of funds. In our case, for years, it was 20,000. We just recently increased it to 30, mainly because they've all gotten into their 20s and the dollar amounts become more meaningful and more thoughtful. But at the age of, from when they were in their teens, basically, they would have three choices that the staff provided each year that were within sort of the likes of the foundation, the historical preferences. And they had to discuss those three organizations and decide how to break up the $20,000. This is in addition to their discretionary funding. They still do that to this day. The amount is $30,000. That might change as they get older and older and older. But the other key milestones are the age of 18. Their discretionary budget goes from $5,000 a year to $15,000 a year. That's at the age of 18 to 25. At 25, it goes up to about 50. And then the interesting thing is, and this will be a new experiment because we have our first person turning 30 this year, but at the age of 30, the expectation is that they're more heavily engaged. I was remiss in telling you that at each of those age milestones, the expectation of their board participation increases. So 1 quarterly meeting a year, then 2 quarterly meetings a year, and then 3. By the age of 30, they're expected to, if they so choose, be heavily involved in the foundation's programming and activity and decision-making, but they are folded into their family branch's budget. So as I mentioned, we have a little funding that comes off the top for his, like 2 or 3 large historical grantees. And then there's the 20% of everybody's discretionary funding that needs to be spent on legacy organizations. And then the remainder is split 3 ways equally into each family. And when a person turns 30, they will fold into their family's budget. And then they'll work as a family to discuss, what's important to them and how they want to spend it together.
Okay, great. There's a lot of questions coming in, and we also received some questions from the audience pre-seminar. So Andy, just to dovetail with something that you most recently said, the question is, I appreciate Andy's comment about getting into new areas of interest slowly and out of interest areas even more slowly. How is that approach balanced with being responsive to emerging social issues and community needs? I'm going to grab that one.
Well, notwithstanding what I said, the strategies for addressing new wrinkles on really difficult problems can change, and often do. I mean, we're picking, very broad areas. Mental health, early childhood education is a recent one. Basic neuroscience research. When you're charting interest area that broad, it's easy to navigate within there and adapt to changing needs. I mean, that said, once the next generation becomes more involved, I imagine that a completely new area will be introduced, but not without a lot of thinking and studying and some time.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in earlier was, I'm interested in exploring these dynamics as the foundation's assets increase. Do you have any strategies or suggestions? And certainly our research has shown that growth in assets is an opportune time when many foundations are able to increase their collaborative work, as well as their individual giving, because the pie is growing, so to speak. And so that is a clear example of what we have seen when increase of assets occur in the future. What we can also say is when we're looking at different systems, to be very clear on purpose. Is it to foster more individual philanthropy or the collaborative piece of it? And make sure that your governance design then mirrors your goals. And as we said, be wary of that just giving, discretionary giving to the next gen can be unappealing. So what we're hearing from Melinda is that not only is it discretionary giving, but then there's involvement at that board level, which is really critical. And so avoid just giving discretionary giving to the next gen. Do any of you have any other ideas, and Ashley too, with your foundation's experience about as assets increase?
Yeah, no, I echo Wendy. I mean, what often you find that inflection point where families face that choice about, do we want to continue on a path of coexistence or operate collaboratively, comes about when there's an increase in assets, basically where people can not take a hit to their personal, to their individual giving, and have an opportunity to now do something larger or different collaboratively. So that certainly, was true in my own family foundation's experience, and certainly something that we're seeing in the research too. Obviously, people can not sacrifice their personal interests while also enabling collaboration.
Right.
And there was a question I will flag around the kind of definition of collaborative versus collective, and this is something we think a lot about, because we will hear often from folks. Well, we are collaborative, right? We decide on things democratically. Right, we vote, and therefore it's collaborative. And what we would challenge and say that's maybe collective, and that it's you are indeed working together, but it's not truly collaborative because you haven't agreed on the ground rules together at the outset. There's not a shared strategy. There's not a shared decision-making process. It's not sufficiently collaborative, or it's not. You have not. Just because there's a shared pot that the money comes from, and you can all, put your personal projects into the shared pot, it's still essentially an individual exercise. And so we, again, define collaborative as looking different than what is often sort of a gray area in many families that over time can actually lead to a lot of strife, where people, you set up a dynamic where family members are kind of competing for their personal interests over a limited pot of funds. And you can imagine how that can play out badly as the family gets bigger and bigger. Curious, but Andy and Melinda, in your mind, if you could tell us a little bit more, Andy, about how you all work collaboratively, like what does that look like for you, the collaborative process? How did you come to the areas of focus? You mentioned that the next generation may slowly have a new area of focus, like what does that look like in practice?
So first, I just want to say that we've done some estate planning to accommodate increased assets, in which we've divided, sometimes roughly equally, money coming to individual members for their own philanthropy, between that and what's going into the family, philanthropies. You know, and so we draw a pretty bright line rule, which is that we've come to over many years, which is when the dollars come into the family enterprise, that's family work, and that's truly collaborative. The general rule is everybody should be a little bit interested in what we do, and some people will be passionate about various ones. Not everybody has to be passionate about everything. And we will not do anything, and this came with some hard experience. We will not pursue any area that violates the deeply held convictions of any one of us. And as I said, we've had experience with that. But so within the context of those rules, we're in it together. And the process for exploring a new area has been the same. It's, probably takes us a couple of years to collect people, to frame the question that we're interested in within the area, to collect people who can help us, sometimes around the country, to travel, to speak, to read, and then to develop an approach. And I'd say we used to do all of this alone. And in the last 3 years, we brought on our first outside executive director to help us do that.
Good. So we're getting some questions about the 20% statement as the tipping point. And someone additionally asked us if it's reasonable to direct a small percentage of funding to go to community foundation donor advised funds as a mechanism to allow family trustees to do a few contributions that are not part of the core mission of the foundation. And yes, that's typically what we have found that is being practiced, that at kind of allowing that individual expression of philanthropic passions vis-a-vis these community foundation donor advised funds or DAFs or branch foundations, et cetera. The 20% tipping point came out of Generations of Giving, and Ashley and I are now analyzing an update of the data that we're receiving to see if that is still bearing true. But at the time, it was based on research done in the past about what families seem to continue in the future as doing truly collaborative family philanthropy. And that's where that 20% tipping point, and it can go either way. So some families can start with all individual giving and then evolve to a 20% and they're doing more collaborative work, or it can start at a very small percentage and work their way up to that max point.
But I do think, and so we're in the midst of the data collection, and so I'm this is
yes
anecdotal. I do think
stay tuned.
You can correct me if this is not in your sort of keeping, instantaneous data analysis that I'm doing. I do think we are finding that over time in many families, as I think Andy in yours, where the collaborative work continues over generations, the proportion that is individualistic decreases over time. And one of the interesting trends that we're also finding in many families that we analyzed, there was a real gap or a difference between the often second and third generations and their approach, where among siblings, it was often harder to find kind of common ground and collaborate. They often kind of saw the way their parents did it in a more individualistic approach. They were used to working that way. It was and chose to maintain working individually. The third generation, the cousins come in often and say, we actually want to work together, partly because they look around and see like, it's not going to work, right? We can't kind of continue to divide the pie, but we also want to find common ground. They don't have the baggage of the sibling dynamics that makes it kind of complicated for them to do that. So in some sense, their lack of familial connection serves them well in their ability to collaborate and find common ground. So we're finding that that's actually a very common evolutionary story in many of the families that we're studying, where there's a real distinction that the siblings, the G2s, may continue to work individually and kind of have a portion of the funding that goes to their individual giving. And then the sort of remainder, which is sort of the growing pot, is collaborative among the third generation and beyond.
Yeah, that would be very similar to your experience, Andy, that you were sharing with us. Yes.
Yes.
And I would also add that in that kind of third generation cousin consortium, you often find a desire for greater impact. So that's often a motivation that we hear when we're working with the next gen leaders is, you know, I can do this by myself and I know how to do it because I've seen my parents do it, but I know that we can have a greater impact and if we do this collaboratively and collectively. So that can often occur. I would add a caveat that for families who are really struggling with a lot of familial tension, and this was one of the questions that we received in the chat box, structure is really not enough. And it really comes down to, you know, can we bridge this gap and continue to work together? Is there a real desire to do this? Or is it better for family members to go their own ways and to increase their individual giving and not partake in that family foundation? And that we have seen in some of our clients, and it's not an easy choice to make, but it often is the one that makes the most sense. There was a quote from one of our earlier family foundations who participated in the research, and she said, you know, we're striving for harmony now, not unity. And for that particular family, they had decided to create branch foundations and still do some of the legacy foundation giving, but that was their solution to the realization and awareness of the great disparity in ideology and in viewpoints. And so they were, that was their solution. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Another question that came in was around board discretionary. Our board has discretionary funds, but some board members exert additional influence to fund their own preferences with the central collaborative funds of the foundation. What suggestions do you have to manage this ongoing dynamic? And I wondered, Andy, if I could punt this one to you, because I think what you had just shared about your experience is probably quite relevant to this question.
Well, we've had a history of that. I guess your studies would show it's, you know, that it's maybe more prevalent in the upper generations. In the lower generations, of which I'm a part, it's harder to do that. But I would, yeah, I would resist. I would try to keep the lines as bright as possible. I would resist fuzzy lines if you can, because I think it leads to just that. You know, you've got some entitlement money over here, and then you've got some influence money over there. And one, I think that compromises your ability to really be collectively impactful. But two, it doesn't do great things to your governance and your family. And I would say on the earlier point, you know, I think the Family Foundation is a good vehicle to strengthen an already strong family. I'm not sure it's a good vehicle to repair deep rifts.
Yes, I think
Good point.
we would very much agree. And Ginny Esposito has said I've heard her say to others and to, you know, to me as well, as I've worked on some challenging clients, you know, family philanthropy should sacrifice neither the family nor the philanthropy. Meaning, you know, keeping it together for the sake of keeping it together often results in not great philanthropy and not great outcomes for the family. So I advise clients sometimes, you know, think about what you're really doing this for. And to your point, Andy, I think it can help it can bring people together in ways that are really amazing and magical. But if there are underlying tensions, it provides, room for those things to play out and grow in ways that can be not productive. And I guess my only additional thought, Melinda, and I'd love to hear from you to this question, is that this is why we see strategic focus narrowing over time, right? To the more specific and focused your funding criteria, the less room there is for that individual influence to play out. And I've worked with clients where, they've had a broad sort of education program, but different trustees come to it looking for funding for pro charter school campaigns and anti-charter school campaigns. And you can, the breadth of those focus areas breeds opportunity for conflict if it is already there.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, I'll say with both of you, Ashley and Andy, you said some really important things that I think everyone should listen to and take to heart. I was a substitute teacher in a former life, and I remember the experienced teachers telling me on my first day to start strict because it's a lot easier to loosen up than it is to become more strict later on. And I think the same thing is true. I don't think that our family, and right now they're managing it well and everyone's very happy and their giving is very meaningful to them. So they don't have an issue with the way they give right now. But I don't think it could be reversed at this point. I don't think you can go from having those huge discretionary pots and to something more singularly focused. And then just want to, talk a little bit about, you said you don't sacrifice the family for the philanthropy. I was, I'm often thinking again, it's really easy to get really philosophical on this as a staff person, but when I think about family philanthropy and third and fourth and fifth generations, I don't know any other circumstances where I'm expected to know my fifth cousins or to agree with these people I don't know that well. And I think family philanthropy poses an extreme responsibility and burden. And I don't think we appreciate that or talk about it enough. I mean, it certainly is a privilege, but it's also a burden. And I think everyone engaged in it should realize that they're not expected for it to be all roses and joy all the time. It is hard work, but the importance at the end of the day, can't be matched. One thing I would like to add, I do agree that you can have a much larger impact with collective giving. And one thing I would say about this, and one of our board members is particularly good in his discretionary spending at specifically not giving large amounts. I just want to put a plug in for the upside of not giving big grants, is you don't end up creating organizations that are dependent upon you. I, of course, see the value in those big collective grants and moving the needle. But as the world of philanthropy is continuing to grow as a sector and in dollar value, and we have not one of us has run ourselves out of a job. I don't want to diminish the value of those small grants that keep the sector going without losing an organization who 1 year doesn't qualify for your funding. So I just want to put a plug in for the small grants too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think some of these families are not necessarily giving higher dollars, but they're thinking more strategically about how to tackle an issue from different perspectives. And but that's a good point, Melinda. Thank you. So there's a question for the research about a second gen or later with no children and how they might feel about their vote being diluted by by having next gen come on to the board as additional trustees. We've had multi-generational families in our research set of participants, and I'm thinking about families who have had this occur, and where it works well is when that aunt or uncle is seen as a leader and a mentor of the next gen. So they are themselves looked to for guidance and have a strong relationship with their nieces and nephews, and that seems to mitigate any tension about having their vote diluted with next gen members coming onto the board. Ashley, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean,
or-
this issue, I feel like that's a whole other.
Another
But I would love to
seminar.
hear Andy and Melinda, this issue of kind of branch representation. It is central to a lot of the work that Wendy and I do, and it's a big one. And I think
Yes.
you have thoughts about it, certainly. And I would say from the research, we worked, some of the foundations in the study did have, branch representation systems in their governance, baked in X number of family members per branch. And all sorts of kind of complicated structures, given the complexity of the families we were looking at. Overall, what our research has found, and drawing on family enterprise research here, is that branch representation tends to kind of not serve its purpose over time, right? It stops. For families get bigger, they become less identified by branch. They, population, merit, interest, these things are not distributed evenly across branches. And so we really advise clients to think about, what is the board that the foundation deserves, as opposed to what is, your interest in having your sort of progeny perpetuated over time. And fundamentally, and Andy, you spoke to this, and Melinda, you spoke to this too, and I'd love to get your take, but what we would advise is that you want the foundation not to be obligatory or an entitlement, right? You want it to be something that people who are interested choose to do, and also can choose not to do if they so choose at some point in their life, that it's not an obligation that they have to participate in order to be part of the family, right? That there's the family and there's the foundation, and they are not one and the same. And so branch representation kind of muddies that in ways that can be complicated. Andy, I'm curious how you all have thought about this in your, in your foundations, plural, and Melinda, how you all are thinking about that issue.
So it's a little troubling to me, I must say. So we don't, and I don't think ever accurately had branch representation. That said, my own immediate family, I have 2 children who now serve on the board of our largest foundation. So my own immediate family has a larger than most representation on the larger, but of course, I'm the leader of it. That gives me pause, but it's softened a bit by the fact that we don't divide assets or interests or whatever. These are collective interests. And so my family has had no more of an impact on which area we've chosen than anyone else. In part because our programs are historical and just the way we go about things. So I don't know how to manage it exactly. I'm nervous about it, but it doesn't seem like a huge problem.
I'll jump in as again, this is from a staff perspective. If I can make a recommendation on how you make it a choice for participation and really a labor of love, I would not stipend or pay the board members. That's I know a huge discussion, but that's what I would advise to make it like a true choice. And that's what I would recommend. There was also a question, if I can just take a second to answer one of the questions I saw that I have a really great answer to. I think it's not my answer, it's just something I've seen. Somebody asked about engagement within the community and collective impact and non-family members. And here in Ithaca, New York, our community foundation sort of reached out to all the major funders in town at the beginning of the COVID pandemic and started sort of a collective impact group. And so all the major funders, including some individuals, not necessarily all 501c3s, get together on a regular basis to discuss what the needs of the community are, and they share grant requests that come in. It's not the way the Triad Foundation operates, especially because we're not specific to place-based giving. So it hasn't really perked our interest to participate heavily in that long-term, certainly in the beginning. But it's been very successful for those who are participating. If anybody wants to ask more about that, I can respond to that privately.
Great. I know we're coming to the end of our time here. Maybe you could each share a risk that you've encountered in associated with engaging in collective family philanthropy, and alternatively a joy, an opportunity, or a lesson learned. Final words of advice to other family philanthropies.
I'll say a risk has basically been when you have an organization that somebody likes and somebody doesn't like, just pretty simple. And that's pretty straightforward, and probably everyone's experienced that. And the joy, I would just really encourage participation. I would encourage board members, family members to go to those conferences, to make the quarterly board meetings fun. And I would say one of our sort of bigger wins is the way that the onboarding of the next generation has happened. You know, and I mentioned this when we discussed sort of the content of this meeting in advance. I think because sometimes that third generation, they're the peacemakers with their parents. They can talk to them with a perspective that comes entirely from love. And so I think if you can engage that next generation in a way that's meaningful, that's been a real joy for me also as an employee, to connect with them by sending them segments and podcasts or snippets from other organizations that they like, or tagging them on Instagram. But I would say that seeing the next generation come on board successfully has been a true joy for, I think, me, and also from the patriarch of the family, watching that happen as well.
Thanks, Melinda. Andy?
So I think the risk is that if you do it, the way we have, purely collaboratively, you're leaving things on the table that people have passions about, but they can't do because they know that we're in the business of doing things collectively. The joy, which is a work in progress for our family. We have a little dish on one of our tables that writes out joy, because it's foreign for us. But the joys, I think, that I can identify have come with some retreats in which our family's relationships have been hard but deepened. And also the many times during the year when we gather with our grantees and our advisors, that is pure joy. And the advisors, our grantee, whatever, they see it collectively. They see the work as our family. They don't really associate it with any one of us. That's a source of joy.
Great, thank you.
I would just add one thing that was brought up in some questions, and Andy, to add to what you were just sharing. I think one of the findings that seems obvious from the research, but when we look at families that have been successful over time, the degree to which they prioritize that learning, and that becomes the central work of the board that they do together, the meeting with, the beneficiaries, meeting with advisors, and learning about the work together becomes the glue. And that requires some sort of central shared endeavor to have that shared learning experience that connects people across branches and generations and all of those things. So Andy, I think just speaking to your point about joy, that is where the joy and the connectivity comes for the most successful families that we looked at.
We want to thank you both for attending this session and for sharing your experience. It was really, really wonderful to have that. Jason,
can I ask you a process question here? And thank you so much, Melinda and Andy. There's so many more questions than we can get to. Is there a way that we can capture these so that we can respond to some of these among the four of us?
Absolutely can do that, and we will do that with Andy and Melinda's agreement, and we can figure that out afterwards. But we'll try to answer as many of them as possible, and we can share that at some point in the future. So thank you for suggesting that, Ashley, and thank you all so much for your really great conversation, your wisdom, your perspectives, and really your clear, deep commitment to family philanthropy in general, but also obviously to the families that you represent. And Wendy and Ashley, thank you so much. There's a lot more coming about this study as we know. And as Wendy mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be having a presentation at our national forum. We'll be releasing a report and things later in the year. So stay tuned. There's a lot more to come around this particular topic and this project as well. As we get ready to sign off, we have just a couple of very quick announcements about some of our upcoming programs. Next month, we have our third 2022 Fundamentals of Family Philanthropy webinar, which will be on the topic of reducing the administrative burden through fiscal sponsorship. This webinar will be held on Thursday, March 10th from 12 to 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time, and please mark your calendars. In this webinar, you'll learn more about different vehicle options that are available to reduce administrative burdens and the considerations for how and when to use each of those options. And CFP is also always pleased to offer our peer networks for those interested in connecting to family philanthropy colleagues who have similar objectives, challenges, or shared experiences. Please contact Katie Scott at Katie, K-A-T-I-E .scott@ncfp.org for more information. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today for this wide-ranging discussion. And thanks again to our wonderful panelists for leading the conversation. Remember to join us on March 10th for our webinar, Reducing the Administrative Burden Through Fiscal Sponsorship. And have a great day, everyone. Thanks, guys.